165. That's the number you need to hold in your mind. Not a vague estimate, not an abstract percentage. 165 deaths for every 1,000 live births. That was the reality in the United States in the year 1900. For every family portrait, for every name dutifully recorded on a census page, there is this statistical shadow. A 16.5% chance an infant would not see their first birthday. In many cities, the odds were worse. The under 5 mortality rate could climb to 25, 30, even 40% in the crowded tenements of the 19th century. When you open the digitized records of the US Census from 1850, 1860, 1870, you see families listed in neat columns. A father, a mother, and a line of children with their ages recorded. But if you pull the record for that same family from the next census, 10 years later, a chilling pattern emerges. A name that was there is simply gone. A 2-year-old child from the 1870 census does not appear as a 12-year-old in 1880. This didn't happen to just a few families. It happened in every census conducted between 1850 and 1910. It is a statistical certainty. A significant portion of the children counted simply vanished from the record. The U.S. Census was and is an extraordinary undertaking, an attempt to create a complete snapshot of a sprawling, mobile, and diverse nation. Between 1850 and 1910, this was an enterprise on foot. Thousands of temporary workers, known as enumerators, were sent out with little training to canvass every household in their assigned district. Imagine a census taker in 1870 walking through the Five Points neighborhood of New York City. He carries a heavy ledger and a pen. He is met with suspicion, language barriers, and crowded, chaotic living conditions. He asks a mother for the names and ages of her children. She might not speak English. She might be illiterate and unsure of their exact birth years. He writes down what he hears, spelling a foreign name phonetically. A child named Janet might be recorded as Janet. A child coughing from whooping cough in the next room might be forgotten in the moment, an undercount. A child staying with a grandparent might be counted there, and also counted here by a worried parent, an overcount. The men who ran the census, like Francis Amasa Walker, superintendent for the 1870 and 1880 counts, were acutely aware of these challenges. They were statisticians trying to professionalize a deeply human and flawed process. The records they produced were the best possible tools of their time, but they are a blurry photograph, not a high-resolution digital file. Modern historical demographers, the scholars who study these records, acknowledge a high failure-to-link rate. Trying to trace one person from one census to the next in the 19th century can feel like detective work. The failure rate often exceeds 50%, meaning that for every 2 people you try to follow, one will be lost due to a name change, a move, or a simple data error. And yet these known flaws don't fully account for the scale of the vanishing children. They explain the static, the noise in the data, but they don't explain the signal. The census, for all its imperfections, was capturing a brutal truth. Until the 20th century, the United States had no standardized national system for birth and death registration. Birth registration areas weren't established until 1915, and the system didn't cover the entire nation until 1933. For most of this period, the federal census was one of the only official documents that recorded a child's existence on a national level. If a child appeared in one census and was absent from the next, there was often no death certificate, no official government paper trail to explain why. They simply ceased to be counted. Here is where the official record does something that happens when confronting unimaginable loss. It becomes statistical. It becomes abstract. The census page shows a blank space where a name used to be, but that blank space isn't a data error. It's an unmarked grave. And the primary reason for that empty space is the most straightforward and the most horrifying of all. The overwhelming majority of these vanished children died. It is a difficult reality to grasp from our modern world of vaccines and antibiotics. In the 19th century, childhood was a minefield. Epidemics of diseases that are now preventable or treatable swept through communities like fire. Diphtheria, known as the strangling angel, could suffocate a child over several agonizing days. Scarlet fever, measles, whooping cough, these were not mild childhood illnesses. They were potential death sentences. There were no vaccines. There were few effective treatments. A quarantine sign nailed to a family's front door was a common sight, a public warning that death was visiting the household. Entire sibling groups could be wiped out in a matter of weeks. Cemetery records from this period tell the story in stone, rows of small headstones, often clustered together with the same family name, all bearing death dates within a few years of each other. The infant mortality rate of 165 deaths per 1,000 births in 1900 only tells part of the story. That number only counts deaths in the first year of life. Surviving infancy just meant entering the next phase of the gauntlet. Children remained profoundly vulnerable. Public sanitation was in its infancy. The general phrasing from the brief, public sanitation was in its infancy and diseases spread easily. When a researcher looks at the census for a family in 1880 and sees a 6-year-old boy named Thomas, and then fails to find him in the 1900 census, the first and most probable explanation is not a mystery. It is that Thomas did not survive to become a 26-year-old man. He is one of the statistical ghosts, his life documented by a single line in a single census before he was erased by disease. Beginning in 1854, a new and radical social experiment began. It was called the Orphan Train movement, and it was the brainchild of a man named Charles Loring Brace. Brace, the founder of the Children's Aid Society, looked at the destitute, often orphaned children on the streets of New York and saw a crisis. His solution was to relocate them, sending them by rail from the crowded, corrupting influence of the eastern cities to foster homes in the rural Midwest. Over the next 75 years until 1929, an estimated 200,000 to 250,000 children were placed on these trains. Imagine the scene. A group of children, some infants, some teenagers, lined up on a train platform in New York. Each wears a tag with their name. They travel for days, arriving in a small town in Kansas or Missouri or Illinois. There they are lined up on a stage in a local church or opera house. The phrasing from the briefs suggested scenes. Local families would choose which child they wanted to take home from a stage in a local church or opera house. For some children, this was a lifeline. It offered them a path out of poverty, a family, and a future they might never have had. But for many others, it was a profound trauma. They were separated from any remaining family, from their culture, and from the only world they knew. Many became little more than unpaid farm laborers. For a historical researcher, the orphan trains create a significant data problem. A child named Giovanni Rossi, living with his Italian immigrant parents in New York in the 1870 census, could be placed on a train. The family who takes him in might anglicize his name to John Ross. In the 1880 census, he appears with a new family, under a new name in a new state. The paper trail is broken. Giovanni Rossi has vanished from his family's record in New York, and John Ross has appeared, seemingly from nowhere, in Kansas. Without a direct link, which rarely exists, one child has statistically vanished and another has been created. This formal relocation program was just the most visible part of a larger, more common phenomenon. Families in the 19th century were fluid and fragile. When parents died or fell on hard times, it was common for children to be sent to live with grandparents, aunts, uncles, or even neighbors. These were almost always informal arrangements, with no legal adoption records. A child listed with their parents in one census might simply appear in a relative's household 10 years later, sometimes with a slightly different spelling of their name. They hadn't vanished, they had just moved. But for someone tracking them a century later, they are another failed link, another statistical ghost. It is not the high mortality alone. It is not the relocation alone. It is that both things were happening at once, on a massive scale. A child could vanish because they died, or they could vanish because they were moved. And compounding both of these realities was a third spectral force, the ghost in the machine of the census itself. The census is not a perfect mirror of reality. It is a human artifact, full of the errors and omissions that come from any large-scale logistical effort. Beyond the simple misspellings and age misreporting, children were housed in institutions that made them difficult to track. Orphanages, asylums, and reform schools enumerated children under the institution's name, not their families. A child institutionalized between census counts would disappear from their home record. But all of these errors pale in comparison to a single, catastrophic event, a singular moment that created the largest data black hole in American history. The 1890 federal census was the most detailed to date. It was a monumental achievement. The more than 62 million individual records were stored, as was common at the time. In the basement of the Commerce Department building in Washington, D.C., there was no dedicated national archive. The records were not seen as precious historical documents, but as raw administrative data. On the evening of January 10, 1921, a fire broke out in that basement. There were no sprinklers. By the time the fire was put out, thousands of volumes of the census had been destroyed by flame. Thousands more were catastrophically damaged by the water used to fight the blaze. After a period of neglect and political wrangling, Congress authorized the destruction of the remaining damaged records. The result was the almost total obliteration of the 1890 census. Of the nearly 63 million individual records, only about 6,000 survive. More than 99.9% were lost forever. This fire created a 20-year gap in the national memory, from 1880 to 1900. An entire generation of Americans, including millions of children, cannot be traced across this gap. A child born in 1881 and counted with their family in the lost 1890 census would appear for the first time as a 19-year-old in the 1900 census. Their childhood, a documentary void. A child who died between 1880 and 1900 would appear in the 1880 record and then simply be gone, with no intervening census to mark their existence. The 1921 fire was not a conspiracy. Historical accounts are clear it was an accident, born of negligence and a lack of foresight. But its effect was to permanently sever the paper trail for millions, creating the single largest vanishing in U.S. history. ACT 6, the unmarked grave. When you place the threads side by side, the mystery of the vanishing children is not a mystery at all. It is a tragedy written in statistics. You start with a society where 1 in 4 children might not reach the age of 5. You add devastating epidemics of infectious disease for which there is no cure. That is the first layer. Then you add a society in constant motion. A formal program that relocates 250,000 children, often changing their names and severing their family ties. An even larger, uncounted number of children moved informally between relatives due to death or poverty. That is the second layer. Finally, you put it all on paper. You use an army of untrained enumerators working under difficult conditions to create a massive, flawed analog database. You allow misspellings, omissions, and duplications. And then you burn the most important volume, creating a 20-year black hole right in the middle of your timeline. That is the final layer. The child who vanishes from the census between 1870 and 1880 is not a single story. They are a composite ghost, pieced together from all these forces. They are the infant dead of diphtheria. They are the boy on the orphan train, renamed and sent to work a farm in Nebraska. They are the girl sent to live with her aunt after her parents died of typhoid. And they are the child whose name was simply spelled so badly that the historian 100 years later could never find them again.